So in this session, you will, jailing is failing, which is the motto of the Justice Reform Initiative. You'll hear something about what we do with people convicted of serious crimes. Crimes serious enough to attract consideration of imposing imprisonment. We're talking about mostly adults in New South Wales, but with some involvement of juveniles, and we will be focusing to an extent also on First Nations people who constitute a totally unreasonable proportion of the prisoners presently in custody in our country. The excuse for this session in this festival is a book that I had published in March of this year called Discretion in Criminal Justice. You won't find it for sale out at the bookstand outside. You will find Frank and Fearless, which was published in 2019. But this book is a bit more of a textbook for academics and for practitioners, and may not appeal quite so much to the general audience. But in that book, I deal with sentencing, with the imposition of criminal penalties, and with the exercise of judicial discretion in that process. And there are really two aspects to the problem that we're presently facing. One is that the exercise of discretion could be extended more by judges and magistrates to seek to achieve substantial justice rather than just simply applying the law. But the major part of the problem is in the law itself, the laws that relate to sentencing. And judges and magistrates must apply the law or resign. That's the option they have. So they are constrained to do what the law requires. So if we want to achieve change, we really do have to change the law. When you listen to our speakers today, I'd like you to keep in mind that when a judge or magistrate comes to sentence anybody, he or she must take account of all the objective circumstances of the offence and all the subjective circumstances of the offender. That's the starting point. But overlaid over all of that, and there may be a huge volume of material to be taken into account, there are three bodies of principles set down by the law which judges and magistrates must comply with. And the first body of 7 principles are the purposes of punishment. These are all laid down in legislation, so they must be applied. And the purposes of punishment are 7, as I said: to ensure that the offender is adequately punished for the offence. Some of it's pretty dumb stuff, I've got to tell you. To prevent crime by deterring the offender and other persons from committing similar offences. To protect the community from the offender. To promote the rehabilitation of the offender. To make the offender accountable for his or her actions, to denounce the conduct of the offender, and to recognise the harm done to the victims of the crime and the community. So all of those purposes have to be consciously taken into account by a judge or a magistrate imposing any punishment. The second body of principles are 5-fold, and they are, first of all, imprisonment is a punishment of last resort. That no sentence other than imprisonment is considered appropriate. That's what the law says. The second, proportionality. The penalty must be proportionate to the offence. Thirdly, totality. So if you are sentencing somebody for a series of offences, the total penalty that comes out at the end must not be disproportionate to the total criminality. Parity, where there are perhaps 2 or 3 people being dealt with for the same sort of offence, there is a principle of parity, that there is not unjust over-punishment of any person involved. And the final one is where you are sentencing for a particular offence, you cannot take into account any aggravating circumstance that is not included in the statement of that offence. It's a rather technical one. And then when you consider all of that, there are 10 sentencing options that are available in any circumstances where imprisonment is an option. The first is imprisonment. We don't have the death penalty in this country anymore, and you can come along tomorrow afternoon and hear about that. But imprisonment, compulsory drug treatment detention through the drug courts, intensive corrections orders, community corrections orders, conditional release orders, dismissal and conditional discharge, conviction without any additional penalty, deferral for a treatment program, a fine, or non-association and place restriction orders. So they're all the options that are set out in the Crimes Sentencing Procedure Act. And judges and magistrates have to take account of all of those matters. But our basic proposition today is that jailing is failing. It's failing to achieve the purposes and the intentions that have been prescribed for it. And our first speaker, Mindy Sotiri, will tell us why that is so and what we are doing about it. So over to you, Mindy.
Thank you so much, Nick. I'd also like to just begin by acknowledging that we're on Gadigal land and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also any First Nations people in the room today. And I was just looking at that glossy picture of me up there and feeling apologetic that I'm not looking as bright as that. I think it's the problem. Sorry, anyway, that's actually nothing to do with what I'm talking about today. I want to start, and sorry, I can talk for hours about this stuff, but I thought I might try and keep it a little bit brief at the beginning so that we can then hear from Aisha and Claude, and then perhaps we can come back to talk about the work of the Justice Reform Initiative. So I want to paint a little bit of a picture about why jailing's failing, sort of building on what Nick has started off by talking about. And then I thought through this panel, what I'd love to do is start really imagining what an alternative or a different kind of system might look like. So I guess the starting point for the Justice Reform Initiative, and for me, and I should say that I've worked for the last 25 years in the criminal justice system, primarily in service delivery in the community sector, so working with people coming out of prison, and Claude will talk more about that. But also, you know, as a very young social work student, when I was doing my first placement at Long Bay, I remember just being utterly stunned by what prison felt like, what it looked like. When I went into the women's prisons, I was struck by the fact that so many of the young women in there were my age. And also that people in prison, I guess contrary to what we all kind of imbibe from our culture, are not actually very different from other human beings. So spending a lot of time in prison and with people coming in and out of prison, that sort of idea gets disrupted very, very quickly. And I was really confused about why we were using prison back then when I was a 20-year-old social worker. And I'm still very confused about why we're using prison, but I've got some ideas about why we do that and how we might do things differently. So I guess the starting point for the Justice Reform Initiative is that the overuse of prison is incredibly harmful for our communities as well as for the people that go to prison. It's incredibly costly, and it's a policy choice that does not make the community safer. So that's where we're starting from, and I'll talk about why that is. We've got actually many decades of evidence that show us that for the vast majority of people that go to prison, it doesn't work to do most of the things that it's supposed to. And it certainly doesn't work to deter, and it certainly doesn't work to rehabilitate. So we need to really start questioning these purposes and the function of prison in those regards. Prison, in fact, is what we would call criminogenic. That is, the experience of going to prison makes it much more likely that you will go on to commit additional offences rather than less likely. So all of the research for decades has shown us this, and you only have to look at our recidivism rates to know that this is absolutely the case. So if we took a snapshot of people in prisons around Australia today, there's about 43,000 people locked up. This is just the adults, and a few more thousand children. But if you looked at everybody who's in prison today, we know without a doubt that 50% of the people that are locked up today will return within 2 years. Now, this number, if I was to go to prison tomorrow, then I would have a 50% chance of going back to prison. I have been fortunate enough to not go to prison, but for people that have been to prison many times, the risk of return goes up the more times that you go. So if you're a young Aboriginal man, then your risk of going back to prison, if you've done 5 or 6 times, starts creeping up to around 70, 80%. We're doing something very wrong if that's the case. If there was any other system, like an education system, which was failing in terms of its stated ambitions in the way that prison is failing, then there would be an outcry about it. But there's not about imprisonment. We're trying to create one just quietly. This is, that's what we're trying to do. If you took a sort of snapshot of the prisoner population today, you'd see that inside our prisons, about a third of people are there on remand. That means they haven't actually been found guilty or sentenced yet. So a third of people are not convicted, and about 70% of those people in the remand sort of centres end up being released either because they've served their time already while they were on remand or because they're found not guilty. So when we're talking about rehabilitation, we need to keep that third of the prisoner population in mind. They haven't actually been convicted of anything. We know that around 60% of people, or more than 60% of people, are imprisoned as a consequence of their drug and alcohol use. We know that more than 60% of people in prison have a mental health condition. We know that between 8 and 20% of people in prison have a cognitive impairment, either in the form of an intellectual disability, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or an acquired brain injury. We also know that there are disproportionate numbers of people from postcodes of disadvantage, so those geographic locations which have high rates of all of the sort of social indicators of disadvantage, high rates of child protection matters, high rates of unemployment, high people leaving school early and so on. We also, of course, as Nick has already said, got a massive overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. In Australia, around 30% of the prisoner population are First Nations. That number, as we will hear, is much higher amongst some demographics, including children who we send to prison, and in some jurisdictions, including the Northern Territory and WA. So understanding the sort of demographics or the disadvantage of people who go to prison isn't, of course, intended to in any way diminish the impact of crime or the experience of victims of crime. But we have to understand who is going to prison if we want to get serious about trying to figure out how we might do things differently and what we might do to address this sort of cycle of incarceration. And of course, I am not the first person to say this. We have more than 30 years in Australia of reports, government inquiries, royal commissions telling us that in order to reduce incarceration, we need to address the social and health drivers of incarceration, including the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody more than 30 years ago. So we've got all of these decades of reports pointing us in this direction, saying, look, prison's not working. It's certainly not working to rehabilitate. It's not working to deter. There's lots of other things that we need to be doing or building in the community that will work and that do work to break cycles of disadvantage. But we have this situation in Australia where both sides, or all sides of politics in some cases, have regularly adopted a tough on crime approach to justice policy, which has resulted in increasing numbers. So that the main reason for increasing numbers, and Nick can talk much more to this and in much more detail, but the main reason for the increasing numbers is nothing to do with crime rates. So for the last couple of decades, Nick, we've had relatively stable crime rates in most of the major categories across, falling in a number of categories, yet at the same time we've had this increasing prisoner population. What we know, and again there's a lot of research around this, is there's absolutely no correlation between crime rates and imprisonment rates. The two aren't related. Imprisonment rates are connected to government policy decisions, and it's related to political decision making around, especially around bail legislation and being tough on crime. So, although this approach, locking lots of people up, making longer sentences, tougher to get bail, can be very politically popular, we know it's really ineffective when it comes to building safer communities. And we also know that it's incredibly expensive. So, Productivity Commission had it at more than $5 billion per annum across Australia. That's just the operating costs. That's not the sort of the new builds that are happening in literally every state and territory as we speak. So we've got this system which is growing and growing and growing. We are out of step with the rest of the world. So we've got these incredible, over the Productivity Commission again in its last report into sort of the failure of imprisonment, a report they called the Prison Dilemma, found that there were only 2 countries between 2003 and 2018 that had a faster growth in the imprisonment rate than Australia. And that was Turkey and Colombia, just to give you a sense of where we are at in terms of how out of step with the rest of the world that we are. Even in the United States, where of course we have inherited and copied sort of in terms of that approach to mass incarceration or over-incarceration, there's been a significant rhetorical shift where in the last presidential debate, you actually had Trump and Biden arguing with each other to see who would be getting more people out of prison, to be blaming each other for the failure of the policy of mass incarceration. We are so far from that in Australia. If you can imagine our political leaders actually having an argument about who can get more people out of prison or who's going to institute sort of a second chance approach to employment, we've got a long way to go. And again, I'll talk after these guys around what I think we can do to bring that along. So I guess the final thing I want to say is that regardless of expressions of purpose, and as Nick's pointed out, there are multiple reasons why we might incarcerate. What we know about everybody that we lock up here in Australia, and in fact around the world, this isn't unique to Australia, is that the vast majority of people in prison come from backgrounds of significant disadvantage. They come from communities where there are often limited resources and opportunity. And in the case of First Nations populations, it's absolutely impossible to disconnect the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from a very, very long history of systemic racism, of discrimination, and from colonisation. So too often in Australia, what we end up doing is managing disadvantage in justice system settings rather than actually building what is required in the community that we know, and again, there's a long sort of list of evidence around this, we know that it will actually work to keep people out. So all of this may actually be a little bit obvious, like we know that we send people to prison who are poor, we know that prison doesn't work. So I guess that what's interesting and what I would love us to think about as we're going through this is, well, why are we persisting with this particular approach? What is it about this approach that so appeals to us as a community or to our political leaders, given what we know about imprisonment's failure, given what we know about the mountains of evidence about what works to keep people out of prison? Why do we continue to rely on it in the way that we do? And secondly, what might we do as a community to actually turn this around if we agree that it's a problem? And no one argues about the demographics of who goes to prison, by the way. That's not something that criminologists kind of have argy-bargy about. Everybody knows who we send to prison. So in my view, it is entirely possible to turn this around, and I'm very, very excited to be working for the Justice Reform Initiative in my role, which is about, we've got a very ambitious target of reducing incarceration by 50% by 2030, but we do need the community to come along on this journey with us. And I think that as we sort of chat today, we can talk about some of the things that we might be able to think through about how to actually turn things around. So rather than punishing disadvantage, we're actually building communities that are safer for all of us. I think that's it from me.
Hello. Okay, there we go. And in case you're wondering as well, my face is not up on the screen. I have not changed my appearance. So I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people as the traditional custodians of the land where we meet today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. As Nick said, my name's Aisha. I'm a proud Quandamooka woman, a descendant from the Nunakul and Nugi people of Minjarrabah, which you might know as North Stradbroke Island, and Morgumpim, which you might know as Moreton Island. I'm currently working as the Queensland Advocacy and Campaign Coordinator for the Justice Reform Initiative. And prior to that, I've undertaken various roles in youth justice, both within the Northern Territory and Queensland. When Mindy asked me to speak on this panel today, at first I was a bit nervous, but in thinking about it, I'm really excited to share my own experiences and really my experiences of how jailing is failing young people, and in particular how jailing is failing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. Right now in Australia, we have a situation where children as young as 10 years old are being incarcerated. They're not just being incarcerated in youth detention centres, they're being incarcerated in prisons that were built for adults. And in many of these situations, young people are being held in cells for up to 24 to 72 hours. And I think, you know, we've all just gone through lockdown with COVID and experienced what it is like to be locked in your house or in your room for an extended period, and the experiences that these young people have in youth detention is far greater than what we have just experienced in COVID. You know, for me, it shocks me that still so many First Nations young people are being incarcerated at higher rates. We in Queensland have 8% of the population aged 10 to 17 are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, yet 64% of young people in youth detention are First Nations. You know, that's a huge gap. And in the Northern Territory, where I've just worked over the last 3 years, on any given day, almost every single young person in youth detention is Aboriginal. And, you know, when we hear these statistics, I think you can't help but think, how and why are we locking up so many First Nations young people? And there are many ways to answer that question. And as Nick has kind of touched on, the law, there are circumstances where the law disadvantages and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people. So, you know, for example, in the Northern Territory, we've recently just had legislation changes that have made breach of bail an offence. And, you know, one of the stories I heard in the Northern Territory was a young person who was on bail in the community, and they climbed under their fence to the grandma's house next door, and their electronic monitoring has pinged. The police have come and arrested them for not being at their prescribed offence. And this is their grandparents' house next door. But I think also, you know, in thinking about what I wanted to speak about today, I really did want to just share my own story as well, to highlight the ways in which colonisation has had an impact on the long-standing institutionalisation of our people. So my pop grew up on Mayora Mission on North Stradbroke Island, and this mission was established for the purpose of assimilation through institutionalisation. And so what this means is my pop and his family, they were not allowed to speak their language, they were not allowed to embrace their culture, and they were really forced to take on European culture and practices and values. And eventually my pop was given, and his family were given an exemption not to live on the mission. And this was because his dad was from European heritage. For most of my life, my pop denied his Aboriginal heritage, and this was because of the racism that they experienced growing up, but also he wanted to protect our family from things like government control over employment and housing, which was very real for Aboriginal people and still is today. For me, this has meant that most of my life I grew up disconnected from my country and from culture. And growing up as a young person, I grew up in Yuin country down in Eden. I did live in a low socioeconomic area, and as a young person, I was exposed to, you know, some pretty hard situations, domestic violence, drug and alcohol addiction, and I naturally gravitated towards other young people my age who probably came from similar backgrounds to me. And at the time, that was a way for me to connect with other young people and feel like I had a safe space away from my house, which was not a safe space. And, you know, that's really driven me to be where I am today, working for the Justice Reform Initiative. And, you know, my life very much could have been different. I could have ended up in a youth detention centre. For me, there was a real pivotal point in my journey where I actually lost one of my really close friends in a drink driving accident. And it wasn't until that happened that I had supports and people come into my life in the community where I could be supported to re-engage with school, get my life back on track, and eventually go on to study at uni. I'm completing a master's now, and to be where I am today. But I think, unfortunately, like so many young people, First Nations young people, don't have the opportunity that I've had. And I think one of the big things that we need to focus on is creating more supports in the community that are led by the community for the community. Over the last couple of months, I've had the privilege of working on country. The Minjarrabaa Morgumpan Elders in Council have set up a North Stradbroke Island Social and Youth Justice Working Group. And basically, they're developing culturally modelled and community-led initiatives for Quandamooka youth, which really aim to divert young people and provide those community supports before they end up in the criminal justice system. And Mindy has touched on this. Right now, I guess you can think about the criminal justice system like a bike. Right now, we're stuck in this one gear of imprisonment gear, and it's getting us nowhere. But actually, what we need is multiple different options that provide avenues for young people to be set on a path for success in their life. And the big thing with the work that I've been involved in on the island, but also some of the services I've been speaking to in places like Townsville, where crime rates are allegedly high if you read the Townsville Bulletin, but probably not if you actually look at the data. These services and initiatives that exist in the community and the solutions that exist in the community are not adequately funded. They're not adequately supported, and there's evidence that they work, but yet we still keep going down this path of tough on crime. So I think, Mindy is absolutely right in that we need to keep this conversation going, and we need to get people thinking about how we can do things differently to change our future, I guess. So yeah, I guess that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Claude. I'm going to set a timer because I can talk.
Yeah.
So I'm very passionate about this, as everyone sitting here, so I don't want to take too much time. Yeah, it's been great to hear. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation where we meet, and acknowledge the elders, past, present, and future, and also apologise on behalf of my ancestors for the damage they caused to the First Nations people, because they benefit from that damage. And yeah, I'm sorry. This is very close to my heart. I'll give you a little bit of my history. So I spent 20 years, or just over 20 years, in heroin addiction and in criminal justice systems in both Victoria and New South Wales. On some sort of, whether it was ICOs, parole. I spent about 7.5 years in prison in New South Wales. I've been out of prison and clean from drugs for 15 years now, and I'm currently the manager of Rainbow Lodge, as Nicholas said, which is it is now the longest running halfway house for men exiting in prison in the world. There was one in Canada, but it unfortunately closed about 1.5 years ago. So we are the longest one. It's been running since 1964. I actually went through Rainbow Lodge in 2006 when I was released from Goulburn Prison. So it's quite amazing, 16 years later, to be the manager of a program that I once went through. And I wasn't successful. I went to Rainbow Lodge and went back to prison. But, that's life. I think what I've heard here today, my experience is prison is a deterrent until you send people to prison. Once I went to prison, I remember walking into prison, I went, that's where everyone was. All my mates were there, all the people I used with, you know what I mean? It was only a deterrent up until I went to prison. my understanding, humans don't rule the world for any other reason that we are the most adaptable species on Earth, and we will adapt to anything, and I adapted to prison like everyone else did. It wasn't a pleasant experience, but we survive. That's what we do as humans, and you work within the environment that you live in, so that was my experience of going to prison. And I think it's also important to say, and I'll give you a little bit of history since I left prison. So I've worked in the juvenile justice system in the youth drug and alcohol court program, which they closed because it was too expensive. My life changed because I went through Narra at Long Bay prison. The last time I went to prison, it was a therapeutic rehab type thing that closed because it was too expensive. Most successful program ever in New South Wales. I've worked in homelessness. I currently work at Rainbow Lodge. I've worked in mental health, both juvenile and adult, and in the homelessness sector. So, and again, I've managed services that I slept in as a homeless person. So I've slept rough on the streets of King's Cross, all that sort of stuff. So I have a lot of lived experience of it, but I also have nearly a decade and a half of professional experience of it. And what I heard here and what I found, especially coming from Victoria, I came here in the early 2000s. When I was in trouble in Victoria, all the drug-related crime was diversionary. there was diversion. They would keep you in the community, send you to counselling. Or I came to New South Wales, and I was very quickly imprisoned. And I was quite surprised by how punitive the system was. Anyone that's been to prison here, we laugh. You get bail once in New South Wales, and then once you've been to prison, you don't get bail again. There is, which as a human right, we're under the Westminster system. A presumption of bail is the cornerstone of our legal system. Yet in New South Wales, there's no presumption of bail anymore. You have to prove why you should be given bail. As Mindy said, 19,000 people get released from prison in New South Wales each year. 6,500 of those are on remand, never convicted. Guilty, innocent until proven guilty is a fallacy. It's on TV shows. It doesn't happen in the real world. And the other thing is, most of those people who don't get bail are socio-economically disadvantaged and First Nations. The guy who gets caught in Bondi with 3 grams of cocaine, who affords the best barrister at $600 an hour, gets bail and doesn't go to jail. And I've seen this. The Indigenous man who's in the magistrate's court in Central Court, who gets caught with someone else's pension card and is refused bail. Seen it. That's a real story. That's the system we're operating in, and I just believe it needs to change. My experience is I've never seen anyone, including myself, punished out of a behaviour. As sucky as it sounds, I changed because I was put in a program where people showed me love, where, they didn't, like 3592337 is my MIN number. I haven't needed it for 15 years. It's etched in my brain. That's the first thing they did to me when I was incarcerated. They gave me a number and told me I wasn't a human anymore. To believe that we have a system, because my understanding of and what I would hope for as a tax-paying, law-abiding citizen today is that if we incarcerate people, we want them to come out better, and we want them to address the issues that cause them to commit crime. That's pretty common sense to me. That doesn't happen. I spent 7.5 years in prison. I never did one program till the very end at Narra, and that was only because the parole board insisted that I go there. So I just think we need to understand that. And when I speak to people, and as someone who's a father and that now, every time I imprison someone for a year, it's, about $130,000 a year. I don't want my daughter to be in a school with 27 kids. I want her to be in a class with 21 kids. I don't want to wait 8 hours because we don't have nurses and doctors at the hospital. We just spent $790 million building a prison out at Clarence outside Griffith, and then we give it to Serco, a private company, to make money off. Yet homelessness, the New South Wales government gives $250 million a year to New South Wales homelessness services. As a community, as a taxpayer, we should be outraged. you know. And I say to people that, you know, the only bed I can guarantee my client is a prison bed. I can't guarantee a woman a bed in a DV refuge. I can't guarantee someone a mental health bed, a detox bed, a rehab bed. The only bed I can guarantee you every night is a prison bed. And you speak to the police and they're as outraged as us because they're dealing with stuff that they don't want to be dealing with. You know, you see it all the time. You know, I just had, you know, yesterday, you know, I just found out that, you know, one of the guys that came through our Rainbow Lodge, he'd been out for 2 years. He was on our board, you know, he took his life yesterday morning. You know, it's really hard to leave prison. And he was amazing, this guy. He was doing really well. But again, he was put in a mental health hospital, and because we spent our money on prisons, they had to discharge him because they needed the bed pressure. I don't know if you work in the system, you'll know that word, bed pressure. They discharged him and didn't tell anyone, you know, and a mutual friend tried to contact him in hospital and wasn't there and went with the police, and, you know, he'd taken his life yesterday morning. You know, he didn't deserve to die, you know. There's something wrong with our system where he's got to leave hospital because we don't have enough money, but we can imprison people, you know. And I'm not soft on crime, believe me. I was outside, you know. I've got guys from bail. I just had the police come. You know, I breached one of my Aboriginal clients because he's broken the law, and I gave him chances. So I don't believe that I'm ever, you know, people need to be held accountable, you know. And I accept, you know, I went to prison and I deserve to go to prison for the crimes I committed. You know, the issue with me is that, you know, my underlying issue was drug addiction, and they never dealt with it for so many years, you know, and I could have had so much more better life for longer and benefited the community instead of costing them. You know, I think I've done a quick analysis on, you know, what I cost the community, not just imprisonment, all the court costs. You know, I was in prison at, like, I went to trial because I had nothing else to do, and then I appealed it to the criminal court because I had nothing else to do. Like, it costs millions of dollars. And I sit back now, I'm embarrassed. But that's the system we've created. I didn't have anything else to do, and my lawyer says, oh, we can appeal that and we'll get you back. You know, I'm not paying for it, but I am paying for it. We're all paying for it. You know, so I think that sort of stuff, they're the conversations we need to have. And I'll finish with this. My dream is, because we need alternatives to prison, is, you know, I want to build the first not-for-profit alternative sanction centre where we send people who are, you know, treated humanely, and we have psychologists and psychiatrists and social, because we have none of them. And, you know, if you haven't been in prison, there's none of them. You know, a nurse will ring the psychiatrist who probably is looking after maybe 3,000 people. 3,000 people, never meets them, and gives them more Avanza, more this, you know. Like, you know, the number one drug I used in jail was mental health medications. We used to call it pill parade, because you just, you know, get all these pills and then come back and swap it. It's chaos, you know. And I had access to drugs every day in jail, every day. So, you know, they're not secure. So that's my dream, is that we have a not-for-profit prison that's built by services that are based on the human, you know, and not the punishment and not the system, because our whole system has become about profit, you know. And we as a community and governments need to take back responsibility. As Nicholas said, our law says the last thing we should do is incarcerate someone. There is no way that should be given to a private company to look after. We as a community and our governments should be in control of that. Thanks.
Well, that's an uplifting series of discussions, isn't it? The big issue is, where do we go from here? And part of the solution is in our hands, in your hands, to do what the JRI is attempting to do, and to mount a national conversation about why jailing is failing and what alternatives are better. It's not as if we don't know what the alternatives are. We need to have our politicians, our policymakers, our legislators on board to make the changes. So we'll keep working at it. Now, there's one statistic that hasn't been mentioned by any of them, so I'm going to throw it in as well, and that is that from recollection, about 45% of our adult prisoners in New South Wales at the moment are in prison on sentences of 6 months or less. Now, why should they be in prison at all is a question that I would ask. Aren't there community-based alternatives that would deal with that sort of level of offending without having to disrupt people, take them away from their families, their employment, their education, their social connections, their housing, etc.? But when you get people with 6 months or less in prison, it takes weeks for a new prisoner to be classified. So everything goes on hold while the classification process is underway. Once that's done, they're then assigned to the institution where they're going to serve their sentence. By that time, it's certainly less than 6 months to go for all of those people, but every program in prison requires at least 6 months commitment. So any educational programs, therapeutic programs, industrial programs, drug and alcohol programs, sex offender programs, you have to sign up for more than 6 months. But those prisoners who are in for less than 6 months by that stage can't sign up. So they're just warehoused. And that's about 45% of the prisoners. So what do they get out of it? How is that making our community safer? I think that's a statistic that we need to keep firmly in mind. But Mindy, you indicated you might have some postscript to contribute.
Yeah, I'm going to tell us all how to fix it just in a few minutes. I think, did you say that there's 5 more or 3 more minutes? Or 10 more minutes.
Don't get carried away. There might be some questions out there.
And I won't talk for long. And I can see that there are some questions there. I guess that what I wanted to say, I mean, firstly, just how good are Claude and Aisha, and thank you so much for sharing your stories. And always just, again, what people outside of the justice system often don't have the privilege of hearing are the voices of people that have lived experience. And my view is that it's so powerful because often, again, the way we think about people in prison is as if they are somehow different from other people in the community. And what we know from all the research is that were any of us to be born into particular sets of circumstances, we could be in that situation. The postscript that I wanted to just spend a couple of minutes on is, what are the mechanisms for change? How do we turn it around, given that we've got ourselves into this, hot mess of incarceration in Australia? The first thing I wanted to say is that it is very clear that the answers to over-incarceration do not exist in the justice system itself. The answers to over-incarceration exist in the community. What is also very clear is that there's not a single reform fix. There are multiple reforms at every moment, both in terms of the touch points, different touch points in the justice system, and also sort of leading up to contact with the justice system, that again, the evidence shows us will work to break cycles of disadvantage. So, for instance, there are pre-charge diversion programs where police, rather than charging children and young people, instead call up a youth worker that's got a 24-hour service and diverts them into a developmentally appropriate service. We know that there are programs, specialist courts, diversionary courts, when people are at the point of court where, again, rather than going to prison, people are either diverted into treatment or diverted into a mental health bed or diverted into, and again, something that's going to address the reasons for their coming before the courts. We also know that in prison there are some things that make a difference. As Claude has talked out, and unfortunately those programs do have a habit of being defunded, but we know that for all of us, when we are treated as humans and when we are treated with respect and when we are treated with love, all of us have the capacity to make change. Making change is unbelievably difficult to do on our own, regardless of what that change is, whether that's leaving a terrible relationship or giving up smoking or stopping heroin or stopping, doing crime. All of it is hard unless you have someone in your corner and someone that actually believes that you can do it. So whatever we're doing for people in prison. We need to actually, again, and I'm not meaning to sound like a big hippie, but there are real principles in terms of best practice support that work for people in prison. And Claude's explained what those are really beautifully. There are also critically programs, supports and services at the point of release that we know, and again, there's really strong evidence around this, make a significant difference in terms of reducing recidivism. But the problem that we're facing is not that we don't know what the solutions are. The problem that we are facing is that we need to bring about a change in our political conversation. A large part of our job, what Aisha and I are doing, is having a lot of, and Nick as well, he's dragged him along to a number of our political meetings. At the moment, our chair, Robert Tickner, is in Parliament every single day having conversations with members of New South Wales Parliament. And in the evenings, we have them out at country women's associations, Rotary clubs, Probus clubs, University of Third Age. The reason we're doing all of that is that we want to build relationships with parliamentarians so that they will make good decisions, so that they will not go back to the sort of habituated kind of reliance on tough on crime politicking, and so that we can, but what the politicians are often saying to us, and very candidly, is we need you to bring the community along with us. Nobody disagrees with our proposition. We have met with the most conservative members of Parliament that you wouldn't expect to be on board, and this is around Australia. Large part of my job over the last year has been having these initial conversations with members of Parliament, again, all sides of politics. I've honestly not had a meeting with anybody who disagrees with our proposition that jailing is failing. So there is absolutely an understanding of it. But what people quite candidly, members of Parliament and senior decision makers, are saying is, we need the community to be brought along. We need people in our electorates, we need our constituents, and we need people who are in our communities to understand the failure of imprisonment the way that we're sort of trying to explain today. So our job, the Justice Reform Initiative, has this huge job to do, which is to really, not that we're saying this so much, we're not sort of trying to delegitimise prison completely, but we're trying to say, look, the way that we're doing things is not working, and we need many more people in the community to understand how significant the failure of this is in terms of both the cost and the financial cost, but more significantly the human cost. So we need, there's the political piece of work, there's the public facing piece of work. So we need to sort of, I mean, doing this sort of stuff is just such a joy, because it's an opportunity to again, get people, you know, to talk about how we can think about this differently. We also need to really, I guess, build understanding of what alternative systems look like. So Claude today has just, you know, he just made up an alternative system that he would love to see. But again, there's actually a whole lot of research around why that particular approach, which is a non-punitive therapeutic model, which is addressing offending behaviour or different kinds of behaviour, is going to make a significant difference. So I see our role as very much around influencing our political leaders, and I would invite all of you to sign up to our website as supporters and sign the petition if this is something that you also feel interested in, but also have the conversations in your community about the failure of imprisonment. We've got a whole bunch of this information on our website as well. But if you do have the opportunity to talk to parliamentary leaders, let them know that this is a matter of concern. This is the last thing I'll say. We had the opportunity to do some market research at the beginning of our campaign, so just a couple of years ago. 78% of people, and this is not surprising, but 78% of people, and this is across Australia, 2,500 surveys and representative panels, just don't know very much about the justice system. What we know is obviously from what we hear on the news or what we kind of read in the papers. And that's not because people aren't sort of wanting to pay attention, it's just that the information's not out there. So our job is talking to that 78% and really trying to bring them along as we try and instill political bravery and also, you know, really, I guess, promote what those alternatives look like.
Short point just touched on by Mindy. This is not a prison abolition movement. We well recognise that there are some people from whom we need to be protected. They need to be imprisoned. But the vast majority of people who are presently in prison really shouldn't be there. Now, I think there was a question, was there? One, two, three. Oh, no, we'll go the other way.
Okay.
1, 2, 3.
So, do you want me to start? Yeah. I'm just interested because I think some of that increase in the prison population is for offences like stalking and intimidation, which basically reflects a shift in policing practices and community tolerance for domestic violence. So I think I'm just interested in how you reconcile. I mean, I absolutely agree with everything everyone said, that prison isn't working, but how do you deal with that need in the community to punish people who are committing violence against women, for example, things that we are really wanting to see a significant shift in the community?
Such a good question, and it's one that we think and talk and grapple with a lot. I guess, and we were actually just talking about this earlier before we came in. What unfortunately we know is that although a period of, and you're right, increases in sort of awareness and reporting and sort of bail refusal for offences that are related to gendered violence have increased, primarily in our remand population. But what we know is that, well, the intent is to use a period of time imprisonment to protect a woman from that potential violence. And that may well work. So taking somebody away and locking them up may mean that that person is safe. So the incapacitation argument or purpose for imprisonment is perhaps one of the least contentious, except for that everybody gets out. And so while you are allowing sort of a period of safety for that person at that particular moment, it's not necessarily going to remain there for the next woman or for that person when that person comes out of prison. Because again, and Claude can probably actually speak better to this than me, but about what it is that prison actually does to you when you're inside.
It is a great question. And I spoke a few years ago up in Maroubra in Queensland, and in that there was a parents whose daughter had been murdered, and there was a prison officer whose sister had been murdered, and the perpetrator was now in the prison out there. And the reality is that in Australia and New South Wales, everyone will get released. My experience of people coming into prison on domestic violence is, and again, it's across the board, is they come in there with other perpetrators of domestic violence, and their resentment, anger and hatred for women is increased, not decreased, and then they are released upon unsuspecting next victims. There is no programs. I tried to get a house going a number of years ago where in the first instance the perpetrator would be removed from the house, because we're always removing the children and the woman, and we know that has long-term damage, schools, all that sort of stuff, where I think we should be removing the perpetrator and putting them in men's change programs so they can still go to work and pay the rent, pay the mortgage, because you can build as many refuges as you want, but the problem is men, not refuges. Like I'll tell this story. Growing up, I grew up in the 70s, and Australia hasn't changed much. Our male violence acceptance is outrageous. Like, you still have in 2022 the Johns brothers on the footy show laughing about some guy getting punched in the head in a rugby game. You know, I won't watch UFC, but it's become the norm. You know, violence, the acceptance of violence in our community is the problem. And until we address that, and we address that in our men, we will always have victims, and we know that they're overwhelming will be women and children. So, you know, and don't get me wrong, we need more refuges and we need to be able to get people out, and people need to be in prison, but they need to be held accountable and access treatment so they don't do it on the next unsuspecting victim. You know, because when you get out of prison, you have a relationship with someone who you have no idea of his history. So, yeah. Yeah.
But I think there's also a community desire to see men held accountable for other perpetrators to have some form.
Yep.
Just before we come to that one, somebody has zoomed in a question for me. We woke up to the sad news of Queen Elizabeth's passing this morning. Firstly, did you ever have an opportunity to meet Her Majesty? No. Although I appeared for her countless times. Obviously without instructions, or without direct instructions anyway. And secondly, should we refer to you as a KC? Yes, as of this morning, I'm no longer a Queen's Counsel, I'm a King's Counsel. So I'll have to change all my cards now.
Cool. Thank you. I've written this down so it's nice and succinct. I'm also very passionate about this, so my breath is a bit shaky because I'm so excited to be in this room. And sorry if you've answered this, I got in late, I got lost. So Claude touched briefly when you spoke about expensive lawyers in that discrepancy. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a drug and alcohol worker, and in Tasmania I spoke with a senior magistrate at length, and he essentially said the reason there's a massive amount of men going into the Tassie prison system at the moment is that the new lawyers being trained up are being taught this more client-centered approach where they don't necessarily give advice on pleas, they listen to the client, what they want to do, and they don't argue back with the magistrate on prison sentences. And they also don't take initiative because they don't know what we as clinicians know about trauma-informed practice. Clients sometimes are so overwhelmed they don't know what to do. And so what he's saying is that there's this Tassie trend that these new school lawyers are contributing to the incarceration rate because they're not fighting back in a way. And I'm wondering whether you've seen anything around that kind of trend with the new training of lawyers contributing to the incarceration rate.
Doctors don't know anything about drug and alcohol, so I don't know why we expect lawyers to. I think it's a really difficult question because it's like school. When I went to school, a school teacher taught you your ABCs and your maths. A school teacher today does a whole lot more. Our expectations upon the professionals within our community are to the level of outrageous that I don't think you could learn it, and I'm not sure what a lawyer's degree is, maybe 6 years. In 6 years, and Nicholas could speak to you better. My understanding of speaking with lawyers is that they're learning about the law, and I've been working in the Wallama list, which is a new initiative in the district court with a district court judge, and it's amazing to watch because he has 2 Aboriginal elders, 2 aunties with him, and he refers to them all the time. And I'm inspired to be in that court and see that most of the people at the table are Indigenous, and that he won't make a decision without adjourning and going and speaking with them. So I think it's unrealistic to believe that anyone in any profession should know all the things. But what they should have is access to the people who do. That would be my advice.
It seems that time might have beaten us. We're getting the 0 sign down here. So I'm sorry that we aren't able to take your question. I was just reflecting on that question that was asked of me in 1954 when the Queen visited Sydney. As a very young boy, I was in the crowd out here in Macquarie Street as she went past. So like Bob Menzies, I did but see her passing by. Now, thank you very much, all of you, for your presence today and your contributions. The things I'm asked to tell you are these, that everybody should leave the room because it needs to be reset up somehow for the next session. Even if you're coming to the next session, leave and come back again. They're very strict about this. And if you have a problem with that, ask somebody. But we're encouraged to ask you to enjoy the rest of the festival. And I think some of these sessions at least will be available on recordings as time goes by. So please join me in thanking our speakers this morning.